Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping off a wet road and into a place that most modern people imagine all wrong. Not a cheerful little tavern with clean sheets and a private corner, but a crowded house of smoke, sour ale, damp straw, shared breath, and half sleep, where your money buys less comfort than permission to survive until morning. If that sounds like the kind of dark old journey you want tonight, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe if you feel like returning for another night by the fire. And now let the room dim around you. Let your shoulders lower. Let your jaw soften. And let the road open in your mind. The evening is already going gray when you first see the inn. Not gray in the modern city way. Not softened by neat streets and lanterns and glass. This is the gray of open country, of a road turning to a ribbon of mud beneath a sky that has not decided whether to close in with rain or simply let the cold deepen a little more. The day has been longer than you expected. Your boots are wet. Your calves feel heavy. Your lower back has begun making quiet complaints of its own. The horse ahead of you, or perhaps the cart you have been walking beside for part of the day, seems just as tired, which is rude in a way, because when an animal looks more dignified in suffering than a human being does, the human being tends to take it personally. The road behind you has become uncertain already. Pools of water lie in shallow ruts. Thin reeds lean in the ditch where dark water gathers. The smell is rich and cold. Earth, soaked wood, old leaves, manure, and the faint mineral scent of rain that never quite arrived properly. You keep walking because in the medieval world there is often nothing else to do. Travel is not arranged around comfort. It is arranged around the next possible stopping point. And when daylight thins, the body starts thinking less about adventure and more about walls, roofs, and whether there will be warmth enough to feel your fingers by morning. Then the inn appears. At first, it is not even the building you notice. It is the smoke, a low smear of it leaning away from the roof line into the evening air. Then a yellow square of light, unsteady, wavering at a shutter gap. Then the bulk of the place itself, low, practical, darker than the road around it, with a yard churned by hooves and wheels into something between mud and memory. If you were standing here with me, you would probably pause before the door. Everyone does. I think, even if only for a heartbeat. The road still smells of cold, wet earth. The inn smells of smoke, bodies, ale, horse leather, damp wool, and old wood. One world ending. Another beginning. I have always found that threshold strangely moving. A medieval inn is not a destination in the modern sense. No one arrives expecting delight. They arrive expecting enough. Enough roof. Enough fire. Enough food. Enough witness. Enough sleep to continue. In a hard world, enough becomes a kind of luxury. The source reminds us that inns were built for movement, not retreat. They sat on roads because roads created need. Merchants, messengers, pilgrims, petty officials, wandering laborers, armed men who said they were not looking for trouble, and therefore almost certainly were. All of them needed a place where night could be survived in company. Some inns stood a little below road level for drainage. Some grew out of alehouses, Some became recognized stopping points by custom more than design. Their reputation mattered more than their beauty. A traveler did not ask whether an inn was charming. He asked whether the roof held, whether the innkeeper cheated too aggressively, whether the ale was drinkable, whether theft there was common, whether a horse might still be present at dawn. And now you were close enough to hear it. Not music exactly, or not only music. Voices, laughter that sounds a little too tired to be joyful, and a little too loose to be entirely sober. A bench leg scraping, the dull clink of pottery cups. Someone coughing hard enough to suggest long familiarity with smoke. Somewhere deeper inside, a dog shifting itself on the floorboards with the confidence of a creature who knows it belongs more securely than half the humans in the room. Your hand reaches the latch. The wood is greasy from long use. The iron colder than expected. A draft slips through the seam of the door and carries warmth with it, but warm in a used way. Warm from many bodies, many meals, many cloaks steamed dry by the same fire. Warmth with memory in it. Then you step inside. The first sensation is not visual. It is impact. Heat meeting wet skin. Smoke pressing into your face. The sudden closeness of a room already full. Your eyes take a moment to adjust because the light is uneven. Fire from the hearth. Candles on tables. Fat lamps, maybe? Depending on the place and the means of the house. Everything moves in patches. A face glows and disappears. A cup flashes. A hand rises, points, settles. The rushes underfoot are stale and soft in places, hiding old bits of food, mud, and whatever else the day has pressed into them. The packed floor beneath is harder than it looks, and the room smells exactly as the source would have you remember it. Smoke first, ale next, sour and yeasty, and a little sweet around the edges. Wet wool, leather straps, stew, onions perhaps, a trace of meat, human fatigue, a little animal smell from the yard and stable side. Not unbearable, just dense. Air that has been lived in. Honestly, I think this is the point where most modern fantasies about medieval inns would collapse quietly into a chair and ask to be excused. There is no privacy waiting for you here. No soft little room above the common floor with fresh linen and a view. Perhaps such a thing exists for someone wealthier, or someone with status, or someone expected. For the ordinary traveler, what waits is negotiation, observation, and participation in a room already halfway through its own evening. A medieval inn is less like checking into a hotel than entering a temporary village that will dissolve by dawn. You feel eyes on you. Not hostile, necessarily. Just measuring. That is part of the economy of the room. New arrivals are information. Where from? How muddy? How armed? How nervous? How rich? Alone or not? Sick or not? Easy mark or dull company? Human beings are old creatures. We were reading one another long before we wrote legal codes. The source is right to stress that inns were social machines as much as shelters. News moved through them faster than parchment. Prices, wars, road conditions, outbreaks of illness, rumors of bandits, marriages, deaths, changes in lordship, tax complaints, strange weather, all of it sat here in the air with the smoke. A traveler entering an inn did not just buy a place near the fire. He entered circulation. There is a bench with space on it, if you are willing to call that space. Two men already sit there, one with a cup, one with his hands clasped over a bowl, as though he fears the bowl may be stolen by spirits, or worse. Acquaintances. A woman farther down is speaking low to a boy half asleep against her sleeve. Someone near the hearth wears the kind of boots that have known a horse for many years. Another man looks like a pilgrim from the badge on his hat, though in such places a badge can be sincere, borrowed, or strategically worn. It is best not to assume too much before the first cup. You set down what you carry. That is another small moment worth slowing. Not because the bundle is important in itself, but because putting a bag down in a medieval inn is an act of trust so modest it barely counts as trust at all. You do not put it far from your hand. You do not stop feeling where it is. You simply lower the weight from one shoulder and let your spine discover, with a little bitterness, how tired it actually is. Now, the fire can be seen properly. It is large enough to matter, but not large enough to make the room generous. Fire in such a place is always political. Those nearest it are warmer. Those farthest are not. Heat has rank. Smoke, too. Near the hearth, your face may grow hot while your boots stay damp. Farther back, the warmth fades into an idea. Sparks rise, twist, vanish into dark rafters, furred with years of smoke. A pot hangs over or near the coals. Its contents smell promising if you are hungry enough. And at this point, hunger is doing half the work of imagination for you. I have always found it strange that once a body is tired enough, even rough shelter begins to look ceremonial. A bench becomes a promise. A crust of bread becomes evidence that the world has not entirely gone hostile. A smoky room full of strangers becomes, almost absurdly, a kind of mercy. But the mercy is rough. The source makes this clear, and it should. Medieval inns were not designed around your inner peace. They were designed around throughput. Keep travelers from freezing, from killing each other too often, from losing all their money, from bringing the road indoors in its most dangerous form. That was enough. A room like this might contain piety and vulgarity, laughter and grief, trade and suspicion, all at once, without any modern need to separate them into themed areas with tasteful signage. And still, after the first few minutes, the body begins to settle. Not because everything is safe. It is not. Because safety is never total here. But because the road is outside, and that matters more than almost anything. Listen closely now. A cup being set down. The shift of wet cloak fabric near the wall. A brief burst of song from the far table. Then, laughter. Then the song abandoned, as if even singing requires more energy than the room can spare. The hiss of sap in the firewood. A spoon scraping pottery. One traveler asking another about the ford ahead. Another swearing the bridge westward is passable. if you do not mind losing a wheel and your temper in the same afternoon. The room is ordinary in the way only survival spaces can be. Nothing is polished. Everything matters. The source also hints at something I think is worth feeling fully. In a world where roads are dangerous and darkness broad, shared discomfort can create a thin layer of belonging. Not friendship exactly. Certainly not romance. But a recognition. Everyone here made it to the door before night grew worse. Everyone here smells of weather and labor and distance. Everyone here understands, without saying it too clearly, that a warm room full of strangers is sometimes better than dignity on an empty road. That is the first truth of the medieval inn. Not comfort, not cleanliness, not charm. Threshold. Pause. Human nearness, purchased by fatigue and necessity. Soon we will move deeper into the common room itself. The benches, the smoke, the talk, the drink, the strange intimacy of being forced into community by weather, darkness, and the limits of travel. But before that, stay with the doorway a little longer. Wet boots. Cold fingers beginning to sting as they warm. Smoke in the throat. Fire on the face. The road behind you disappearing into black. A room ahead of you where no one fully rests. Yet everyone hopes to. That hope is enough to cross the threshold. And once you do, the medieval night closes behind you. Not kindly, perhaps, but firmly, and the inn takes you in the only way such places know how, by giving you warmth without privacy, company without softness, and just enough promise of survival to make the body unclench, one careful breath at a time. There is one more quiet thing worth noticing before we move on. No one in that room is surprised by the arrangement. That is perhaps the strongest sign that the inn belongs fully to its world. Shared air, shared benches, shared danger, shared hope for morning. Modern people would call much of it uncomfortable, because modern people expect walls between themselves and strangers. But a traveler in this age expects negotiation instead. Space is borrowed. Warmth is borrowed. Even sleep will be borrowed. The inn does not promise ease. It promises a temporary place inside other human lives. And for tonight, that is enough. By the time your eyes adjust to the firelight, the room has already decided what you are. Not who you are. That takes longer and may never matter. But what kind of presence you are likely to be for the next few hours. Quiet or troublesome. Payable or not. Sick or merely tired. Useful for news. Worth avoiding. The common room does this quickly because it has to. An inn does not have the luxury of innocence. Too many boots have crossed its threshold. Too many stories have entered wearing lies. Too many knives have slept under cloaks. And still, every evening, the room opens itself again and allows the road to pour in. If you were standing here with me, just inside the door, you would probably not know where to look first. The fire pulls the eye, naturally. So do the brighter faces nearest it. But the room is doing many things at once. A woman carrying cups between shoulders and elbows with the calm balance of someone who has walked this floor in dark and daylight alike. A servant boy stooping to lift a fallen spoon and nearly losing his own footing in the rushes. A broad-shouldered man in a weathered cloak, speaking in the low, guarded tone of someone giving information without fully giving trust. A pair of pilgrims, or men dressed as pilgrims, warming their hands and speaking of saints with just enough detail to sound convincing and just enough vagueness to leave room for doubt. The source makes this point well, though perhaps not long enough for my taste. The common room was not simply where one ate and drank. It was where movement turned into temporary society, a place for trade, argument, rumor, bargaining, song, warnings, prayer, vulgar jokes, and the quiet practical exchange of root knowledge that could mean the difference between arriving somewhere tomorrow or not arriving at all. To enter such a room was to enter a current. You might sit still, but the inn itself was always in motion. Now that you have crossed the threshold, the deeper details begin rising out of the blur. The benches are rough, some polished smooth, where generations of hands and sleeves have passed over them. Some still splintery at the edges. Tables are scarred, stained by ale, knife points, grease, and old heat. The floor carries rushes that have been replaced often enough to avoid total disgrace and rarely enough to hold on to a very human history. Crushed herbs perhaps in places, either for scent or for pretense, both useful in their way. Under all of it, the packed earth or plank beneath reminds you that this building is not built for softness. It is built for use. The fire itself is not a romantic hearth out of some painted Christmas memory. It is working, hungry, a little uneven. Logs settle with sighing cracks. Resin pops. Smoke pulls upward, mostly, though not entirely, and drifts back down in threads whenever the draft changes its mind. If you sit too near, one side of your face warms while the damp in your boots begins to rise and steam. Sit too far, and the fire becomes a rumor that other people are enjoying on your behalf. I have always found that medieval warmth sounds nicer in modern speech than it would have felt on the skin. Warmth then was patchy, negotiated, often shared through inconvenience rather than designed comfort. The heat you get is the heat left after the room takes its share. At some point you are noticed by the innkeeper. Not welcomed exactly. Measured first, then addressed. This is another difference the source understands clearly. Hospitality in a medieval inn is practical. The innkeeper does not greet you like a host at a dinner party. He, or sometimes she, receives you like a manager of weather receives one more storm cloud. With experience, with calculation, and with just enough restraint to keep the thing from bursting over the furniture. Look at the innkeeper closely now. The hands are busy before the face fully arrives in your memory. Coin taken. Cup set down. Cloth dragged across a table that cannot truly become clean, but can at least become cleaner than it was 5 minutes ago. Eyes moving, all the while. Not darting. That would be nervousness. Scanning. That is something else. The door. The fire. The man near the back who has had too much ale but not yet enough to lie down. The young traveler who keeps touching the pouch at his belt. The stable boy late from the yard. The pilgrim who may indeed be a pilgrim but has suspiciously good boots for one. All of this is counted. The source reminds us that an innkeeper in the medieval world was not simply a cheerful seller of beds and stew. He was responsible in a very serious way for what happened under his roof. If a guest was robbed, if a horse vanished, if a fight broke open into something bloodier than fists, if a suspicious death occurred, questions would lead straight back to him. Reputation, therefore, mattered more than decoration ever could. A bad roof might be forgiven. A dishonest scale, perhaps. But a house where men vanished, or coins moved too mysteriously from purse to purse, would not keep the road's trust for long. This gives the room a subtle order that a tired traveler may not fully notice at first. Certain men are seated where they can be watched. Certain benches are left clear until needed. Cups are refilled for some and delayed for others. The strongest drink is not always given to the loudest voice. Trouble is managed in inches. A hand on a shoulder, a dry remark, a look that says enough. Most governance in such a place is not dramatic. It is preventive. And yet there is humor in it too. There has to be. A world without private rooms cannot survive on solemnity alone. Someone drops a chunk of bread and a dog reaches it before the man does. The room laughs. A merchant complains about the state of the road and is told the road complained about him first. A pilgrim mutters a prayer over his ale, and someone nearby says, the ale will need more help than that. It is not wit polished for courts. It is tired humor, road humor, the kind that keeps strangers from becoming enemies too soon. As you edge farther into the room, perhaps toward that patch of bench we noticed earlier, the physical experience of being among so many bodies becomes impossible to ignore. Cloaks steam slowly as they dry. Damp leather releases its smell. Hair carries traces of rain. Smoke. Horse. Hay. Hands are reddened by cold. Knuckles roughened by work. Nails blackened in the ordinary old way that comes from labor and the absence of leisure. Even the silence between words is crowded here. Breathing. Swallowing. Small shifts of posture. The room is full of proof that people have bodies, and bodies in the medieval world were never abstract things. They ached, sweated, smelled, took cold, took heat, occupied space without apology because there was too little space to spare. That may be why the loss of privacy feels so strange to modern imagination. We are trained to think rest begins when other people disappear. Medieval travel often taught the opposite. Rest began when enough other people were near that the dark outside became less dangerous than the room within. A bowl arrives eventually, or at least the promise of one. Perhaps you have paid already. Perhaps the innkeeper has judged from your face and your boots that payment will come if you are allowed to thaw first. Medieval trust is not sentimental, but it is sometimes strategic. A man too cold to speak clearly is often a poor customer until fire has had 10 minutes with him. When the food comes, the common room shifts around it. People who had seemed half absorbed in their own fatigue revive a little. Hands move. Elbows make room, or pretend to. Steam rises if the meal is hot enough to deserve the name. The source speaks of simple fare, stew, coarse bread, maybe onions, maybe bits of meat, if fortune is kind and the traveler can pay. None of it would impress a modern food writer. which is perhaps the highest compliment it can receive. This is food without performance. It exists to persuade the body not to fail. If you were standing here with me, spoon in hand, you might notice how quickly gratitude lowers its standards when hunger is real. Salt would matter. Warmth would matter. Thickness would matter. A crust soft enough to bite without argument would matter. The bowl itself warming your palms would feel nearly ceremonial. And around you, other people would be making the same small peace with the day. The room would grow quieter for a while, not because it had become calm, but because mouths and stomachs had temporarily outranked conversation. I have always thought there is something almost sacred in a rough meal shared among strangers who have no real reason to trust one another, except that night has fallen and everyone is tired. Not friendship, not community in the sentimental sense, just a recognition that hunger flattens many differences and that warmth, once ladled, belongs to whoever can reach it in time. This is also where the inn's role as an information exchange becomes easiest to feel. A flooded ford 2 miles east. A toll collector farther north who has doubled his demands since the last market week. A bridge gone soft at one end. A widow on the next road selling decent oats for less than the market price if approached respectfully and not like an idiot. News like this does not look grand in the telling, but it is the actual bloodstream of travel. More useful than legends. More urgent than politics half the time. The innkeeper, meanwhile, continues orbiting the room without seeming to move very quickly. That is a skill. People in charge of disorder always learn a pace that looks slower than it is. Another cup. A glance toward the fire. A brief word with the stable hand. A correction to the serving girl who nearly gives a larger portion to the wrong table. Coins counted again beneath the hand, almost invisibly. A nod to a local man whose presence alone may be enough to discourage certain kinds of foolishness. The room is governed by small motions. And still, beneath all of this, fatigue keeps working. Voices sink and rise. Someone near the wall has begun yawning, without much attempt to hide it. Another traveler rubs at one knee as though bargaining privately with it. The child against the woman's sleeve is fully asleep now, head heavy, mouth parted, oblivious to everything except warmth and exhaustion. Even the room's laughter has changed by this point. Less bright, more slurred at the edges. The common room is beginning its slow descent toward night. Before that happens fully, one more truth of the medieval inn should be allowed its due. Shared space does not automatically produce shared tenderness. A room can be communal and still contain suspicion. Your bundle stays near. Your purse stays nearer. A knife may remain where your hand knows it can find it. You do not stop listening simply because you have sat down. The road has followed people into the house. So has the possibility of theft, insult, misunderstanding, and all the ordinary little darknesses of travel. That is why the relief of the inn is always mixed. Warmth enters. Yes, so does vigilance. If you were sitting here with me on the bench now, the stew nearly gone, the fire lower than before, the innkeeper still moving through the room like a man, arguing silently with entropy, I think you would begin to understand the real texture of the place. Not cozy, not brutal, necessary. a human pause built from smoke, labor, appetite, caution, and the thin decency of not letting strangers die outside when a room, however rough, can still be made for them within. Soon the bowls will be cleared, or shoved aside. Straw sleeping places will matter more than tables. Blankets, if there are enough, will become objects of more interest than stories. The common room will begin that peculiar transformation from public life into shared sleep, where speech dissolves, hands stay close to possessions, and rest comes only in pieces. But before we sink into that darker, quieter stretch, linger one moment longer with the living room of the inn itself. The bench under you hard, the spoon warm from use, smoke turning the rafters black, a dog sighing under the table, rain perhaps beginning at last against the shutters, or perhaps only the wind pressing damp air into the cracks. Strangers at one long table, each carrying private worries that the room does not ask them to explain. And in the middle of all of it, food, watchfulness, and enough heat to keep the body from despair. That was the common room, not a background detail. The heart of the inn, the place where the road came indoors, and where, for a few hours, before sleep and before dawn, the difficult world outside was made just barely livable by firelight, noise, and the presence of other tired human beings. By now, the room has had enough time to stop seeing you as a sudden interruption and start placing you properly within its own internal weather. That weather has a center, and once the first hunger has softened and the first cup has taken the edge from the cold, it becomes easier to see who holds it together. It is the innkeeper, not in the grand sense, not like a king on a chair beneath a canopy, and not even always in the obvious sense. Sometimes he is merely the man who keeps moving when others sit. Sometimes she is the woman who hears every raised voice before the people raising it realize they are being heard. In either case, the authority of the house is not announced. It is practiced. And in a place like this, practice means everything. If you were standing here with me, half turned toward the hearth so your boots could steam a little while you pretended not to enjoy it too much, you would first notice the innkeeper through motion rather than appearance. A hand on a jug, a glance at the door, a quick look toward the back corner, where two men are talking lower than men usually talk, unless coin, trouble, or both are nearby. Another look toward the fire, because the fire can become a problem almost as quickly as a drunk can. Then a turn toward the stable yard, because horses are money with opinions, and the wrong stable boy can convert a decent evening into a memorable disaster in less than a quarter hour. The source is right to make this figure central. A medieval innkeeper is not mainly there to smile, flatter, and ask whether you would like your pillow plumped. He is there to keep the house functioning in a world where roads are uncertain, tempers short, theft common, and rumor nearly as combustible as lamp oil. In some towns, the innkeeper answered directly to local authority. In others, the office rested more on reputation than law. But either way, the truth was the same. If something ugly happened under that roof, the roof itself could not be blamed. The blame would walk upright and pay taxes. That changes the whole feeling of the room. Modern people sometimes imagine old hospitality as either sentimental or brutal. In truth, it is often managerial. The innkeeper watches the flow of cups because drunkenness has gradients, and each gradient requires a different response. One man may be cut off with a joke, another with a stare, another given watered ale and allowed the dignity of not noticing. A larger fellow who can afford better ale may receive it only slowly if his shoulders suggest he is carrying a grievance like a weapon. A pilgrim with a saint badge may be trusted less than a mule driver with mud to the knees, because costume is cheap and blisters are usually honest. Honestly, I have always found that kind of intelligence more impressive than the grander forms of wisdom that history likes to celebrate. It is one thing to write laws for a city. It is another to keep 12 damp strangers, 2 local men with unfinished arguments, 1 half-asleep child, a coughing merchant, 3 horses, and a kitchen fire from becoming a tragedy before dawn. Watch the innkeeper now. The face is lined in the practical places. Around the eyes, from smoke, poor light, and years of reading people in under a breath. At the mouth, from restraint more than cheer. The shoulders do not waste movement. Coins are counted once and then again by feel. Bread is cut with the exact pressure needed to make portions look fair, even when fairness is more art than arithmetic. Cups are set down with enough firmness to end debate when needed. A room like this does not run on force alone. It runs on signals. The source hints at how much legal responsibility could hang on such a person, and I think it deserves a little more dwelling. In many places, the innkeeper could be held responsible if a guest was robbed in the house. If a horse disappeared from the stable and no good explanation followed, the complaint might not end with the thief, because the thief, like all truly annoying people, tended to vanish before sunrise. The house, therefore, had to guard its own trust. That trust was worth more than the extra coin earned by pretending not to notice a suspicious hand. So the innkeeper notices everything. The pouch a traveler keeps touching too often. The knife placed too openly on a table as if making an announcement. The local man whose silence has become less soft than before. The serving girl whose patience is thinning. The boy near the door who is old enough to lie badly and young enough to think no one can hear the difference. Even the dog near the hearth is part of the system. If the dog rises and stiffens, eyes move. If the dog remains asleep, people breathe easier without admitting they are taking instruction from an animal. If you were sitting here with me long enough, you would start to see how the innkeeper governs without ever seeming to make speeches. A spilled cup is answered with cloth before apology finishes leaving the mouth. A bench dispute is ended by assigning one man a better angle toward the fire and the other a larger pour, which costs little and prevents a great deal. A traveler asking too many questions about other people's belongings is redirected into a conversation about road tolls, which is usually enough to make everyone equally miserable and therefore peaceful. It is a peculiar genius. And then there is the money. The moment of payment in a medieval inn is never just accounting. It is diagnosis. What you pay, how you pay, when you pay, whether you count carefully or too casually, whether you complain before seeing what is offered, whether you have small coin or only larger pieces. All of this says something about what kind of knight you are likely to be. The innkeeper hears it the way a physician hears breath. You reach for your purse or pouch, and already the room feels a little different. Not hostile, simply attentive. Coins have gravity. They pull awareness toward themselves. If you were standing here with me at the trestle board where payments are handled, the wood smooth under one hand and sticky under the other from ancient spilled ale, you would notice how quickly fatigue and calculation can coexist. Your fingers are stiff from road cold. The pouch knot takes longer than it should. You hope no one is noticing, though of course everyone notices everything when money appears. Inside are coins that have already traveled almost as much as you have, some rubbed thin at the edges, some bright enough to suggest recent exchange. They make a small sound against one another that in a quiet room might seem delicate, but here sounds like decision. The innkeeper does not quote a polite, fixed tariff as though reading from a board under a brass lamp. Instead, there is the older, murkier negotiation of use, status, and circumstance. A place by the fire is not a room. A patch of floor with straw is not a chamber. A blanket is not guaranteed. Stable space costs. Better ale costs. Hot food, if any remains, costs. Privacy, if it exists at all, costs more than many travelers can justify, especially when the road tomorrow will demand coin of its own. So the bargain begins. Not dramatic, nothing theatrical, just the old quiet dance. What can you pay? What will that buy? What can the house spare? What must be reserved for the expected merchant party not yet arrived? Or the local reeve who sends word ahead when he travels? Or the priest who always complains about prices as though humility ought to be accepted as currency? The innkeeper weighs not only your money, but your likely inconvenience. The thin, tired traveler with little baggage may fit easily into the room. A man in partial armor pays not only for space, but for the possibility that he sleeps badly and wakes touchy. A woman traveling with a child pays in the coin everyone spends most reluctantly. Sympathy, because sympathy takes up room where profit might otherwise sit. I have always liked that medieval bargaining is rarely pure greed and never pure generosity. It is a thicker substance than either. The innkeeper cannot be a saint, or the house fails. He cannot be a fool, or the house fills with the wrong kind of men. He cannot be entirely hard, or no one comes back when the roads are passable. So he lives in the middle, where most durable human arrangements live, charging enough, yielding where useful, remembering who paid honestly last season and who left without settling for the oats. The source reminds us that reputation was the true architecture of an inn. Wood can rot, roofs can leak, but a house known for fair dealing survives longer than a prettier house known for sly waits and vanished boots. That is why even the smallest exchanges feel steadier than they look. You are not only buying supper and straw, you are entering the ledger of a place that cannot afford too many damaged nights. At last, the innkeeper nods. Not warmly, perhaps. Warmth is expensive and usually reserved for people whose return is certain. But the nod is enough. You have been admitted properly now. A patch of floor, or perhaps a place on a pallet if fortune is kinder than usual. Straw, maybe a blanket if the house has one left not already claimed by someone sicker, older, richer, or simply quicker. Food from the pot if the pot still gives. Ale. Stable arrangement if needed. Just enough to say you will not be put back on the road. There is relief in that. though relief in the medieval world rarely arrives clean. It arrives tied to other feelings: weariness, suspicion, gratitude, a small resentment that the price was perhaps a shade too high, a larger gratitude that there was a price at all rather than a refusal. The innkeeper jerks his head or points you toward where your belongings may go. Perhaps near the wall, perhaps not too near the hearth if sparks are lively tonight. Perhaps beside two other travelers already set for the night, which means your privacy is now a story from another civilization. The stable arrangement is passed to the yard boy, who receives the instruction with the exact facial expression of a person who has been told to do 3 things at once and hopes at least one of them will become someone else's problem. Somewhere in all this, there is room for a little humor. There has to be. A traveler asks whether the straw is fresh and receives the kind of look one usually gives a man who has inquired whether the moon might be scrubbed before rising. Another asks whether the blanket is clean, and the innkeeper answers, clean enough to be warmer than the night outside, which, in fairness, is probably the right answer and perhaps the only honest one. And still the room keeps working around you. More cups, more coins, more glances, more small interventions that keep tiredness from becoming conflict. The innkeeper remains at the center, though never still. A keeper not only of property and payment, but of temperature, timing, and tone. He knows when to let the room hum and when to lower it, when to press for coin now and when to collect in the morning, because a traveler near collapse is of more use alive and rested than argued with into stupidity. That last detail matters. A good innkeeper understands sequence. First, get the wet man warm enough to count. First, get the horse seen to before it founders from neglect. First, seat the old woman before she falls and creates a theology of lawsuits no one needs. Then settle the rest. Medieval survival often depends less on kindness than on the right order of practical decisions. If you were standing here with me while this all unfolded, I think you would feel the room becoming less like a chaotic gathering and more like a ship at sea. Not because it is calm. Ships are never calm in the deep sense, but because everyone aboard is now committed to making the same structure survive the night. The innkeeper is not the captain exactly, but close enough for one evening. Soon we will move from the bargain itself into what the bargain buys. Straw under your shoulders, rough wool over your legs, stew in the bowl, ale in the cup, and the slow realization that a medieval night of rest is really a series of compromises between hunger, cold, and trust. But before we go there, stay one moment longer by the trestle board. Coins counted. Terms agreed. A nod from the innkeeper. A place made for you in a room that had not been waiting for your particular existence, and yet has somehow found a gap where your tired body can fit. That may be the innkeeper's real craft. More than ale, more than fire, more than supervision. Making temporary room in an already full world. Charging for it, certainly. Watching it carefully, always. But making it all the same. In an age of roads, rain, and fragile human plans, that is a respectable kind of power. Once the bargain is struck, the night begins to take on a different shape. Before, you were still negotiating with the road, carrying its cold on your back, its damp in your boots, It's uncertainty in your chest. Now the road has stopped at the door. What replaces it is not comfort exactly, but arrangement. A place to sit. A bowl. Some ale. A bit of floor or pallet, with straw enough to soften hardness into something the body might forgive for a few hours. That is what you have really bought. Not luxury. Not privacy. A managed descent from exposed travel into temporary human shelter. The source is especially good here, because it does not try to gild the experience with modern softness. Payment in a medieval inn did not open the door to a clean chamber, scented with herbs and supplied with crisp linen. What it gave, most of the time, was a right to remain. A right to food if food remained, and a right to occupy a patch of the indoor world after dark. Once you understand that, the whole place becomes more interesting. The inn is not failing at being a hotel. It is succeeding at being a survival device. If you were standing here with me now, one hand still holding your cup because letting go of warmth too early feels foolish, the innkeeper or his servant would direct you toward where you can leave your pack. Perhaps against the wall. Perhaps under the bench for now. Perhaps near the place where later you will stretch out with your head half on the sack itself. Because trust, while useful, has its limits. Nothing in the room says settle in as though you belong. Everything says fit yourself into what is available. The straw comes next. It is an ordinary detail, almost too ordinary, which is why it matters so much. Modern people hear straw and often imagine some golden rustic softness, a farm-scented dream under winter stars. Real straw under a tired body in a medieval inn is neither poetic nor entirely miserable. It is simply material. Dry enough if luck holds. Scratchy. Uneven. Better than earth. Better than road. Better than standing. Not better than a true bed. Though a true bed in this world belongs to a narrower category of people than most travelers can claim. A servant drags or points out the pallet space. Perhaps it is already spread. Perhaps it is no more than loose straw banked against a timber frame or along the wall. You crouch to test it with one hand. It rustles with the soft, dry sound that always suggests both harvest and mice, which is hardly fair to either. Dust lifts faintly. The smell is warm, old, vegetal, with traces of smoke worked into it by years of indoor use. It will cling to your clothes by morning. So will everything else. I have always found it oddly intimate. The first moment you touch the place where you are going to sleep among strangers. A floor patch. A pallet. Some straw and rough cloth. So little. Yet the body reacts as if it has been shown a gift. Fatigue lowers standards with astonishing speed. Then comes the blanket, if there is one. This deserves slowness, because blankets in such a setting are never neutral. They are warmth made visible. They are also status made visible. A rich traveler may have his own bedding rolled behind the saddle. A monk may travel with more patience than possessions. A merchant may argue for a better blanket because he has argued successfully over everything else in life and would hate to interrupt the habit now. For the ordinary tired soul with coin enough but not too much, what appears is usually coarse wool, heavy, smelling faintly of lanolin under smoke and human use, thick in some places, thin in others, but honest enough in its purpose. If you were standing here with me when it was handed over, you might be surprised by its weight. Rough things are often heavier than pretty ones. The wool catches at the skin slightly if your hands are dry from cold. It carries old warmth in memory only. Actual warmth must be summoned by body heat and patience. Still, when you fold it once and lay it where your shoulders will later go, it already changes the future. Morning will be difficult, yes, but perhaps less difficult than it might have been. And then, at last, the food reaches you properly. The source speaks with practical honesty about the meal. Simple stew, bread, ale, no elaborate menu, no individual preferences attended to as though the cook were a mind reader with a kind heart. This is food for the road made indoor. Pot-based, stretchable, thick where possible, salty if fortune smiles, honest enough that a hungry body stops complaining and turns grateful before the mind is fully caught up. The bowl is hotter than expected when it lands in your hands. That alone is almost emotional. Heat through pottery into fingers that have known too much damp. Steam rising against your face. Carrying onion. Broth. Root vegetables perhaps. Maybe bits of meat, if this has been a better market day than most. The bread is coarse, and the crust perhaps a little harder than your teeth had hoped for. No one cares. You dip it anyway. Hunger is the finest sauce ever invented, and also the least likely to receive proper credit. If you were sitting here with me on the bench now, the bowl held low, the fire reflecting in the surface of the broth, you would notice how the act of eating changes the room. Shoulders lower, voices soften. The first desperate edge of arrival passes. Even suspicion becomes less theatrical on a full stomach. Men who looked like they might become problems begin to look merely tired. The woman with the sleeping child finally takes 3 proper mouthfuls in a row. The pilgrim lowers his head over his bowl like a monk before scripture. The merchant with the cough discovers that chewing leaves less breath available for complaining, and thus performs a useful civic service for a few minutes. The common room becomes almost gentle at this stage, though never fully. There is always movement at the edges. Someone arriving late. Someone rising to check a horse. Someone trying to count change in a way that suggests arithmetic has recently quarreled with ale and lost. But the center of the room settles. Spoons. Steam. Bread passing from hand to hand or table to table in the vague old way that says accounts will be settled if they can be and remembered if they cannot. The ale, too, plays its part. Not fine. Not delicate. Alive in the sour, yeasty way of old brewing. Safer at times than water. Rougher than thirst would prefer. But exactly suited to an evening like this. It lands in the body as warmth by persuasion rather than force. One swallow. Then another. Enough to soften the shoulders. Not enough, if the innkeeper has any sense, to turn the whole house into a theological debate conducted with benches. Honestly, I think that is one of the less appreciated skills of pre-modern life. Knowing how much rough ale is enough for comfort and how much is enough to ruin a room. The line is thinner than the drinkers ever believe. The source also reminds us that sleeping arrangements were closely bound to what one paid and who one was. A traveler of means might secure a separate room, perhaps not entirely private in the modern sense, but more sheltered than the common floor. A poorer traveler would share the communal sleeping space, perhaps with a pallet if fortunate, perhaps with a corner and loose straw if not. There is no need to flatten this into misery. Human beings are very good at sleeping wherever the body runs out of objections. But it is worth feeling the social texture of it. Rest is stratified. Warmth is stratified. Silence, such as it exists, is stratified too. If you were standing here with me as the room began reorganizing itself towards sleep, you would see little signs of this everywhere. One man led upstairs with a candle because he paid for a chamber and intends everyone to notice. Another already claiming more bench than his price truly justifies, and receiving a look from the innkeeper that suggests geometry will be corrected soon. A pair of poorer travelers quietly arranging themselves along a wall where the draft is less direct. A woman shaking out an extra cloth over straw for the child. Then, sitting on her own cloak, because motherhood in difficult places often means giving softness away first and not bothering to announce the sacrifice. I have always found it moving how quickly a room can turn from public life to shared vulnerability. The tables remain, the cups remain, the fire remains, but the meaning of everything shifts. The bench is no longer for conversation. It is storage for boots, or a place to fold a cloak, or a barrier to stop a sleeping body from rolling too near the embers. The floor becomes a map of negotiated distances. Not too close to strangers if avoidable. Not too far from warmth if possible. Not under the leak in the roof if the weather turns. Not near the door, unless coin is thin enough to make dignity a secondary concern. And then there is the business of belongings. A modern traveler leaves things in a room because the room is supposed to guarantee them. A medieval traveler sleeps around things. Purse tucked under a shoulder, or under the folded hem of a cloak. Boots close enough to touch with a foot. Bundle serving as pillow, which is practical, but says slightly uncomfortable things about the state of public trust. A knife within reach, not necessarily because danger is certain, but because uncertainty is. The source is right, that sleep here is social and negotiated. I would add that it is also geometric. Every object, every limb, every folded blanket has a tactical position. You know that feeling when you try to sleep in an unfamiliar place and one part of your mind never fully stops counting exits, sounds, distances, and the exact location of your bag. Medieval travelers did not invent that sensation, but they certainly gave it plenty of exercise. The innkeeper, meanwhile, does not disappear once payment is done. Quite the opposite. This is the phase where his work becomes subtler and perhaps more essential. Fire banked just so. Last cups denied or delayed. Stable rechecked. Door bar tested. Latecomers assessed. Sleeping spaces corrected before grievances ripen into midnight quarrels. He may finally eat something himself, standing perhaps, because men and women who keep houses often discover that sitting down too early invites catastrophe in one form or another. If you watched long enough, you would notice how the room trusts the innkeeper without exactly loving him. That is probably the healthiest form of public trust. He does not need affection. He needs compliance, memory, and the occasional returned customer. At some point, your bowl is empty. The last warmth in it leaves your hands. The blanket waits. The straw waits. Your body, having eaten and sat and warmed slightly, begins to feel heavier than before, which is unfair and inevitable. Fatigue that could be ignored on the road becomes persuasive indoors. Knees complain when you stand. Shoulders pull as the damp shirt shifts against skin that has cooled again. There is an almost comic moment in every such evening when the traveler realizes that despite hours of longing for shelter, the act of getting down onto the sleeping place may itself require a brief conference with mortality. Still, down you go. The straw gives a little, then not enough. It has ridges, hollows, a stalk or two that seems personally offended by your existence and has chosen the back of your neck to express it. You shift. Then again, the blanket comes over you, rough and faintly prickling, heavier over the legs than the chest. A good sign. Legs lose heat like traitors if not handled firmly. The fire from here looks different. Lower. More distant. Less like a center and more like a negotiation. Around you, others are settling too. Cloth moving. Boots thudding softly to the floor. A muttered prayer. Someone clearing his throat with the patient despair of a man who has been clearing it the same way every winter for 20 years. A child turning in sleep. The dog circling twice beneath a table and then dropping with total faith in his own arrangements. Soon we will move fully into that shared darkness, into the breathing room of the medieval night, where no one sleeps deeply at first and everyone remains, in one way or another, partly awake. But before we let the room go dim, stay one moment longer in this stage of the evening, because it tells the truth of the inn more clearly than any grand description. Payment made. Food eaten. Blanket claimed. Straw tested. Belongings tucked close. A little warmth inside you at last. No romance. No luxury. Yet no longer on the road. And that alone feels like enough to make the body whisper its tired thank you into the wool and smoke and dark. The medieval inn has done what it was built to do. It has reduced the night to something survivable. Not easy. Not private. Not even especially restful yet. But survivable. And for most travelers, in most winters and rains and uncertain roads, that was the line between complaint and gratitude, and a line worth paying for. The room changes more quickly than you expect once people decide they are no longer ordinary guests for the evening, but sleeping bodies in waiting. It does not become peaceful all at once. That would be too modern, too gentle, too neat. Instead, it loosens in stages. Voices shrink. Cups stop moving. The brightest faces fade back into shadow. The fire lowers itself from public spectacle to working duty. What had been a common room full of appetite becomes a room full of arrangements. If you were lying here with me now, blanket rough against your chin and straw, making little honest arguments with your shoulder blade, you would notice first the sounds. Not silence. Never silence. A medieval inn does not know silence the way a private bedroom does. It knows layers. The last bench scraping. A muttered apology. Someone shifting his boots with his feet until they settle where his hand can find them in the dark. A woman whispering something low and soothing to a child who has half woken and is not quite sure where the night has put him. Then the deeper sounds. Breathing. A cough. A sigh that seems to come from the far wall, and then another from nearer the hearth. The dog under the table dreaming with a little twitch in one paw. Wind touching the shutters as if checking whether the house truly intends to hold. The source was right to insist that sleep in such a place was communal. I would go even farther. It was negotiated. You do not simply sleep. You settle into an agreement with every other body in the room. I will not take more room than I can defend. You will not step on my cloak if you can help it. He will keep his boots close. She will rise only if the child needs something. The man by the wall has placed his bundle under his head and would probably wake if a moth looked at it too boldly. The pilgrim nearest the door snores like a pious sawmill. No one loves this arrangement. Perhaps, but everyone participates in it because the alternative is the road, and the road at night is a harsher negotiator than any room full of strangers. That is the strange mercy of shared sleep. It is awkward, but it is witness. You are not alone in the dark. And in the medieval world, that fact had a value modern people sometimes forget. Solitude sounds noble when weather is mild and doors are thick. It sounds different in a wet season with thieves about, wolves in certain regions, hostile men in others, and a body tired enough to know it cannot keep watch and walk again tomorrow without help from some kind of shelter. So the room becomes a kind of breathing field. One man settles heavily onto a pallet with a little unwilling grunt every spine eventually invents for itself. Another takes far too long arranging his cloak beneath his head, the sort of painstaking care that usually means the cloak is expensive, or the man has convinced himself it is. A woman pulls the blanket higher over the sleeping child, and then lies down in the narrow crescent of warmth his small body makes. Near the hearth, the luckier sleepers have already begun to sink, their faces amber on one side and dark on the other. Farther out, along the wall where the warmth reaches only by rumor, people keep their cloaks on and tuck their knees toward their chests to hold what heat they can. If you were standing here with me a little earlier, while the room was still rearranging itself, you might have thought the hardest part of the night would be finding a place to lie down. It is not. The harder part is letting your own body admit it is vulnerable enough to sleep among people it does not know. That admission happens in small steps. First, the hand loosens from the cup because the cup is empty, and there is no point pretending otherwise. Then the shoulders, which were lifted all evening in the old road habit of readiness, begin to drop. Then the legs extend a little. Not fully. Never fully at first. Fully extended legs imply faith in the room. Most travelers begin with the compromise position, half curled, one arm under the head or over the purse, one knee bent, as if the road may call its question again, before dawn. Only later, if warmth and weariness conspire together strongly enough, does the body flatten into something like actual rest. I have always found it strange how quickly human beings can adapt to one another's breathing. At first, every noise feels distinct. That man is too loud. That one wheezes. Someone is muttering in sleep. The child is congested. The dog dreams with tiny yips that would be amusing if one had not paid for the privilege of hearing them. Then, little by little, the room braids itself into one large animal sound. Not one breath, but a woven thing. Many lungs keeping time badly, and yet somehow together. A communal, rough lullaby made of survival. The fire helps, though not equally. The source was right about that too. Heat in a medieval inn is distributed like favor, imperfectly and with visible consequences. Close sleepers loosen first. Their hands uncurl. Their boots come off if they dare. One man even lets his head fall back against the wall, mouth open in the shameless surrender of the deeply tired. Farther away, the room remains more brittle. Blankets are pulled tighter. Cloaks stay fastened. Feet stay in boots, or nearly so. Bodies conserve themselves. The great lesson of pre-modern rest is that sleep does not erase hierarchy. It simply expresses it through temperature. The air itself changes as the night deepens. Earlier, it was thick with ale, stew, and damp wool, newly steaming dry. Now another smell rises, slower and stranger. Warmed rushes, cooling ash, old timber, human sleep, and the faint, stale sweetness of extinguished candles where a servant has pinched some down to save what remains for morning. It is not an unpleasant smell if one is tired enough. Tiredness is generous in its judgments. It softens the nose. It excuses the room. It says this is shelter, and shelter need not be lovely to be loved a little. Somewhere near midnight, though no clock here bothers to name it, the room enters that first true basin of sleep. Conversation has gone. Even muttering is rare. The innkeeper still moves, but more quietly now. One last turn around the room. One last look at the bar on the door. One last glance at the banked fire. Perhaps he adds a piece of wood. Perhaps not. Firewood costs money, and dawn comes at the same pace whether a traveler is perfectly comfortable or merely alive enough to stand. The innkeeper knows this. So do the regulars. The occasional wealthy guest complains about such calculations. The rest understand them. You know that feeling when you are not fully asleep, yet no longer fully in the room. The body is heavy. Thoughts lose their grammar. The fire behind closed eyes becomes a reddish drift. The voices you heard earlier dissolve into nonsense, and the mind starts handing you fragments. A road turning into a river, a horse's back becoming a hill, a spoon in a bowl sounding somehow like bells. That is the sort of sleep the inn offers first. Fragmented, light, made of thresholds. A true surrender comes only later, and not for everyone. For many people in this room, the old instinct stays partly awake. One hand remains near a pouch. One foot touches a boot. One shoulder stiffens every time a board creaks or someone turns over too sharply. It is easy to romanticize endurance from a safe century. It is harder and more honest to admit that many medieval travelers probably slept the way animals do in exposed places, deeply enough to continue, lightly enough to survive interruption. There is humor in some of it. Even now, the pilgrim by the door snores first like a saw, then like a choking goose, then falls silent so long that half the room, if anyone were awake enough to care, might worry he has gone on to his reward before finishing the night. Then he starts again with doubled conviction. Near the wall, a merchant who spent all evening describing his own importance curls around his bundle like a child guarding an apple. The dog, who paid nothing, has found the warmest place in the room and sleeps with the kind of confidence only innocence and shamelessness can produce. If you were lying here with me, perhaps your cheek against folded cloth that smells faintly of rain and your own long day, you might begin to feel a tenderness for the room despite yourself. Not because it is comfortable. It is not. Not because the people are known to you. They are not. But because every person here has set down some small portion of alertness in trust that the house will hold until morning. Even suspicion has softened into ritual. That is something like civilization, in a rough draft form. The roof speaks now and then. Timber settling. A soft complaint from somewhere near the rafters. Wind sliding over the outer walls and finding the cracks, because wind always does. The building is alive in the old way, not engineered toward silence, but full of little replies to weather and temperature. A modern sleeper might call them disturbances. A medieval sleeper would more likely sort them quickly into categories. Roof, door, stable side, fire, human, animal. Once sorted, they can often be ignored. The mind becomes a watchman even while half dreaming. I think that may be the deepest difference between their sleep and ours. Modern sleep, when we are lucky, aims at oblivion. Medieval travel sleep aimed at continuation. You did not need 8 perfect silent hours beneath a scented blanket and a moralized mattress. You needed enough warmth not to wake shaking, enough stillness that the body could unclench, enough shared presence that danger would not have to be faced alone. And so the night keeps lowering itself. One traveler wakes briefly, sits up, drinks from a cup he had hidden by his elbow, then lies down again with the slow care of a man trying not to wake his own bones too sharply. Another shifts near the hearth and steals half an arm length, more warmth than custom strictly permits. Though no one objects, because custom at this hour is softer, and everyone who might object is asleep or trying desperately to be. A coal drops inward with a tiny sound like someone biting down on a secret. The dog sighs. The child murmurs and settles. Far off in the yard, a horse knocks wood with its hoof, and then all is still again. This is the long descent, not one dramatic fall into unconsciousness, but many small permissions granted to the dark. The room, which earlier held trade, caution, complaint, and rumor, now holds only bodies and embers and the simple old hope that dawn will come before the cold becomes too clever. There is also the curious comfort of knowing that everyone around you is failing at perfect sleep together. No one is floating in a scented dream. No one has disappeared into a noble, private silence. The room is full of small defeats, cold feet, itchy straw, uneasy turns, muttered fragments. And yet from all those little defeats a workable night is assembled. That may be the true art of the inn. It does not create ideal rest. It gathers enough imperfect rest from many tired bodies and lays it across the darkness like another blanket. For now, though, stay in this first basin of shared sleep, where discomfort has not vanished but has been folded, for a little while, into something nearly peaceful. The inn has done its work. It has gathered scattered travelers into one dim breathing room. It has given them heat enough to loosen, darkness enough to drift, and witness enough that each can surrender just a little more of the road. It is not deep sleep. It is not pretty sleep, but it is real. And for this world and this night, it is enough to carry everyone one careful hour closer to morning. The cold before dawn has a character of its own. Evening cold is still negotiating. It arrives with the traveler, presses at the door, seeps from damp clothes, makes the fingers sting when they first lift a cup or untie a strap. But the cold before dawn has already won most of its arguments. It does not rush. It settles. It knows the fire is lower now. It knows the room is full of sleepers who cannot keep feeding the hearth every quarter hour. It knows exactly where the cracks are in the shutters and under the door and between the warped boards, and it slides through them with the patience of something that has all night. If you were lying here with me now, the first sign might not even wake you fully. A cheek gone cooler than before. The tip of one hand no longer warm where it lies outside the blanket. The odd sense that the straw beneath your shoulder has somehow become harder, though in truth it is your muscles that have stiffened while you slept. Then another sign. A draft against the ankle. A small involuntary tuck of the knee inward. The body making its own little defensive calculations before the mind joins in. The source understands this stretch well. Medieval sleep was rarely one smooth descent and one smooth return. It came in pieces, and the deepest test often waited in these hours when the fire had sunk. The food was long gone from the blood, and the body had to decide whether to keep sleeping through discomfort or surface toward wakefulness and risk losing the thread entirely. Around the room, little changes begin. The man near the wall who had gone to sleep on his back now turns onto one side and curls slightly, drawing blanket and cloak together under his chin. The woman with the child does not wake fully, but her hand moves over the small body beside her and draws it closer by pure instinct. The merchant, who earlier looked smug enough to sleep through a siege, is now burrowed into his own bundle with far less dignity than he brought to supper. Even the dog abandons his earlier sprawl and tightens into a circle, nose under tail, as though embarrassed to have trusted warmth so easily the first time. The room sounds different, too. Earlier, the breathing had braided into something heavy and almost oceanic. Now it becomes less even. A sleeper sniffs and wakes just enough to pull the blanket higher. Another gives a small, irritated cough, not the loud coughing of evening smoke, but the dry little cough of a throat, noticing the cooler air. Someone near the door mutters half a sentence, perhaps to a dream, perhaps to a knee that has discovered the floor under the straw and filed a complaint. A board ticks softly as the house adjusts to temperature. In the stable yard, a horse shifts. Then another answers. The kind of small, dark exchange animals have when they too are waiting for light. I have always found that hour strangely intimate, because all the performances are gone. No one is being a merchant now, or a pilgrim, or a man of better lineage than the rest. The cold strips everyone back to the same few concerns: heat, position, breath, possessions. Morning. It is a democracy of discomfort, though not a perfect one. The sleepers nearer the hearth are still better off. Privilege, like heat, lingers longest where it began. If you were standing here with me instead of lying down, and I do not recommend it unless your knees are younger than mine, you would see how the embers change the whole room. They no longer throw bright, active light. They pulse. They breathe in little red hollows beneath a thinning skin of ash. Sometimes one glows more fiercely for a moment when the draft reaches it, then settles back as though remembering it cannot afford extravagance. That light is beautiful in an austere way. It turns the room into a cave of outlines. Faces disappear. Blankets become uneven low hills. A hand here, a boot there, the curve of a shoulder, the pale oval of someone sleeping with half the blanket kicked away because exhaustion made him overconfident an hour ago, and the cold has not yet corrected him. The smell shifts again in these hours. Less ale now. Less stew. More wool. More cooled ash. More timber. More human breath, trapped in coarse fabric. There is a faint sourness to a room where many people sleep close together, but not a monstrous one. Just the ordinary truth of bodies existing through the night. A trace of old smoke sits on everything. Even dreams in such a place would likely smell of smoke if dreams had any decency about them. You know that feeling when you are still inside sleep and yet already aware that morning will be work? Not emotional work. Physical work. The business of uncurling. Of finding your boots with feet gone stiff. Of standing when the body prefers negotiation. That feeling begins here, long before dawn is visible. The body senses the coming effort and sleeps less deeply because of it. One of the odd comforts of shared lodging appears in this hour too. Even half asleep, people monitor the room, not consciously always. More like herd animals in bad weather. If someone rises too quickly, others stir. If a noise is wrong rather than merely annoying, heads lift. If the door bar knocks, or the stable horse panics, or a stranger moves in a pattern that does not fit ordinary midnight need, the room becomes alert faster than any one person could manage alone. That collective vigilance is untidy, but real. Privacy is gone. Yes. In exchange, there is a net, loosely woven, full of holes, but often enough to catch the first sign of trouble. The source hints at the inn as safety without softness, and nowhere is that more true than here. A traveler alone in a ditch-side shed might have quieter sleep, but if danger came, danger would have all the room it wanted. Here, even the vulnerable hours have witnesses. That does not guarantee anything, but in old worlds, guarantees were rare luxuries. Witness was often the closest substitute. At some point, a sleeper near you wakes enough to check his belongings. You hear the tiny rustle, feel perhaps the minute movement through the floor or straw. Then a hand, quick, practiced, touching pouch, knife, bundle, boat, each in turn. Not panic. Inventory. Then the hand settles back under the blanket. I think that gesture may be one of the purest forms of medieval travel psychology. Trust the room enough to sleep. Trust it never so much that you stop counting what is yours. Honestly, it is difficult not to admire the efficiency of people who can wake from rough sleep, conduct a half-conscious audit of their worldly goods, and drift back down without composing a dramatic inner monologue about it. Outside, the wind changes. Not stronger exactly, more pointed. It finds the shutter seam nearest the pallets along the wall and sends a narrow current across the floor. Several people feel it at once, though no one says anything. Blankets rise. Bodies tuck tighter. One man pulls his cloak over his head and immediately looks, even in silhouette, like a resentful turnip. The dog abandons his original place entirely and moves closer to the banked heat, which, if we are honest, is exactly what most of the room would do if dignity did not keep them put. If you were lying here with me, this would be the time you might drift into odd, small dreams. Nothing grand, not visions. The sort of dreams born from discomfort and repetition. The road you walked becoming endless because your legs ache. A church bell turning into a spoon on pottery. The innkeeper counting coins that become raindrops. The blanket vanishing and reappearing. Then waking briefly because your own foot has found a cold pocket in the straw and objects on principle. This is where sensory memory deepens. The roughness of the blanket at the lip, the smell of your own damp cloak, now mostly dried but still faintly holding the outside night. The pressure of the bundle under your head. The way the floor beneath the straw reminds the bones that beneath all this accommodation lies hardness. Patient, unimpressed, permanent. I have always thought that medieval rest teaches a blunt but useful lesson. Comfort is only one way to sleep. Another way is to cease demanding that the night revolve around your preferences. That does not sound romantic, and perhaps it should not. Yet there is a kind of freedom in it. Once the body accepts the terms, enough warmth, enough shelter, enough witness, enough quiet to drift in and out without being forced fully upright. Then sleep becomes less a performance of ideal conditions and more a collaboration with what is available. Still, no one should pretend the cold hours were easy. Joints stiffen. Toes go numb at the edges. The lower back discovers every dishonest promise made by the straw. The man by the door eventually wakes with such determination to be miserable about it that he sits up, swears softly to himself, rubs both hands hard together, and stares at the embers as though offended they are not personally devoted to him. A few others surface halfway into wakefulness with him, not by choice, but because dissatisfaction has a tendency to travel in communal lodging. This is where the innkeeper earns his keep once more. Perhaps he has not truly slept at all, or perhaps people like him learn to sleep in fragments so small and efficient that others mistake it for wakefulness. In any case, there is movement near the hearth, a shape rising from a bench or from a side pallet, a quiet crouch, the sound of poker on ash, one or two carefully saved pieces of wood added to the red core. Not enough to lavish the room with comfort, enough to keep bitterness from setting in too deeply before dawn. That small act changes everything. Not at once, but the room feels it. Embers brighten. A little flame takes hold around one edge of the new wood. Warmth does not return generously, but it announces intention. Hold on. Morning is coming. That is all the fire says, and for this hour, it is enough. If you were watching, you might see 2 or 3 sleepers visibly loosen, even without fully waking. The body is a very old listener. It hears warmth before thought can form words for it. And now the darkest part of the night begins slowly giving way. not to sunlight. That would be too abrupt. To a thinner blackness. To the sense that the room has endured the worst of the cold, and that time, like the fire, has decided not to die out completely before dawn. The horses in the yard stir again. Somewhere a cock may crow too early, which is exactly the kind of confidence such creatures have always possessed. The child near the wall sleeps more deeply now, having won his private battle with the cold by annexing most of his mother's blanket. The pilgrim snores on, spiritually untroubled and acoustically appalling. The source says this was the hardest stretch, and I agree. Evening can be romanticized. Arrival can be turned into atmosphere. Supper can be described with a kindly sort of hunger. But the cold before dawn strips all that away. Here the inn is only what it can truly provide. A roof that holds. A door that bars. A room of other breathing bodies. A little embers glow. Enough blanket. Enough straw. Enough shared wakefulness that no one is entirely abandoned to the dark. That is not a small thing. Soon, gray light will thin the room. Faces will return to themselves. Belongings will be checked more honestly. And the whole common floor will become once again a practical place full of people who need bread, road directions, and another reason to stand up. But before dawn fully arrives, linger one moment longer in this hour. The wind outside, the banked fire waking a little, a room of strangers, curled in rough wool and smoke, the innkeeper half risen from his own short sleep to tend the common survival once more, the body learning, unwillingly perhaps, that rest does not always feel like peace while it is happening. Sometimes it feels like endurance that will only later, in daylight and motion, reveal itself as enough. And that is exactly what this inn is giving. Not sweetness, not dreams, not silence. Enough. Enough warmth to keep going. Enough shelter to reach morning. Enough broken sleep to gather the body back together for one more day on the road. By the time the first gray light begins to appear, it does not arrive like mercy from a stained glass window. It arrives thinly, reluctantly, in quiet little changes that the body notices before the mind is willing to admit them. The room is still dark. The fire is still mostly embers. No one has suddenly become comfortable. Yet something has shifted. The dark is no longer complete. The inn has stopped belonging entirely to night. If you were lying here with me, still half inside the rough sleep of the last few hours, the first sign might be the window shutter edge becoming slightly less black than the wall around it. Then the shape of the bench returns. Then the rafters begin to separate themselves from the smoky dimness above. A cup on the table becomes a cup again instead of a lump of shadow. The room regains its objects, one by one, and with them comes the old unwelcome fact that the body must soon begin negotiating with the day. That negotiation begins with stiffness. The source understands this beautifully, though perhaps with more restraint than the body itself would appreciate. Medieval sleep in an inn was enough to preserve you, not enough to flatter your joints. You rise by degrees. First the head, then the shoulders, though the shoulders object. Then one elbow planted into the straw or floor for leverage. Then the full bitter truth of the back makes itself known, which it does, with a kind of offended dignity, as if the entire arrangement had been your personal idea and not the only available mercy between dusk and dawn. Around the room, everyone else begins this same awkward resurrection. The man near the wall blinks at the grayness and immediately checks his bundle before checking whether his own legs still belong to him. The merchant coughs himself upright. The pilgrim near the door, who snored through half the night like a saint sawing timber for heaven, wakes with the serene confusion of a man who seems surprised that sleep, having inconvenienced everyone else, has the audacity to inconvenience him as well. The child is the only creature in the room who rises without bitterness, though even that is less nobility than the mysterious cruelty of youth. The air feels sharper now. Night cold and dawn cold are not the same. Night cold can still be fought by blanket, closeness, stubbornness. Dawn cold has a cleaner edge to it. It arrives with the light and makes clear that warmth belonged to darkness only temporarily. The fire gives less than it did in the middle of the room because now the room itself is changing allegiance. Outside, air pushes in around the door and shudders. The smell alters again. Less sleep. Less settled body heat. More ash. More wet morning. More stable yard. More bread, perhaps. If bread is already being broken somewhere nearby. If you were standing here with me now, your feet finding the floor through boots not yet fully warmed by living skin, you would hear the room returning to speech in fragments. Not conversation yet. Sounds of inventory. A pouch untied. A buckle adjusted. A man clearing his throat before he says anything because the smoke of the house has lived in it all night. A woman smoothing cloth over a still drowsy child. Someone asking whether there is any bread. Someone else answering that there is always bread if you lower your standards at the correct hour. I have always found dawn in shared lodging peculiarly honest. The evening allows for a little performance. One can be amusing. One can be guarded. One can drink enough to soften edges and seem broader than one is. Morning removes all that, politely but firmly. It gives people back to themselves in their least theatrical form. Hair flattened strangely. Eyes narrow with poor sleep. Hands cold and practical. No one at dawn in a medieval inn is trying to look impressive. They are trying to become portable again. The innkeeper is already awake, or perhaps has only changed categories of wakefulness. There is a difference. The person who keeps a house like this does not move from sleep into day as others do. He moves from watchfulness into another kind of watchfulness. The source was right that the innkeeper resets the room almost before the travelers can fully rise. The hearth is stirred. Ash moved. 1 or 2 pieces of wood added if supplies permit. Cups gathered. Bowls stacked. Floor space reclaimed from the temporary geography of sleeping bodies. The house is being turned from dormitory back into common room, even while some of its inhabitants are still trying to remember their own names. If you were watching closely, you might notice the speed of it. A blanket reclaimed from someone who rented it rather than owned it. Straw kicked back or redistributed. A bench cleared with 3 motions. The dog out from under the table and already underfoot again. Promoted by daylight from sleeping witness to active nuisance. The room does not indulge transition for long. It has another day to serve. Then comes the simplest meal of the whole stay. If meal is not too generous a word, bread, certainly if the house has it. Coarse, dense, perhaps yesterday's, perhaps today's if fortune and labor aligned kindly. Ale again, though weaker perhaps, or something nearer small beer. Sometimes cheese, sometimes nothing more than a chance to eat what you already carry while standing near a little surviving heat. The source understands that the medieval inn is not trying to produce a memorable breakfast experience. It is producing departure fuel. And yet, at dawn, even coarse bread can feel almost philosophical in its goodness. Your hands, still slightly clumsy, break it. The crust resists. The inside gives. Steam, perhaps, if it is newer than expected, though not often enough to build a life around. You chew while looking not at the food but at the room, now fully returning to shape. Faces seen clearly for the first time. The man whose voice sounded huge in the dark is smaller than he seemed. The merchant looks richer in the purse and poorer in the cheek. The pilgrim badge was indeed real, or at least has survived inspection by morning, which is nearly as respectable. The child has become curious again, which is the first true sign that the night is over. The source also reminds us that morning in an inn was an information exchange no less than the evening, only sharper, more practical, less ornamented by ale. Which road today? Which bridge still holds? Whether the rain southward worsened in the night, whether the toll officer at the next crossing has become greedier or merely more creative in the language he uses to disguise greed, who passed through after dark, who left before sunrise, whether riders were seen farther up the road. Such fragments are traded almost casually, but they are worth more than comfort. In a world where travel is uncertain, knowledge is breakfast. You know that feeling when you leave a place and only in the doorway realize that you have learned its rules well enough to survive it. That is how dawn at the inn feels. During the night, the room was all sensation. Smoke, heat, cushion, exhaustion. By morning it has become legible. You know where the warmer places were. Which sleeper muttered, and which stole blanket space by quiet degrees. Which board near the wall complained when stepped on. Which servant moved quickly, and which one vanished whenever work appeared. This tiny, temporary world has already taught you its map, and now you are leaving it. Before that, though, there is the checking of belongings. I suspect this ritual has changed less over the centuries than almost anything else. Hand to pouch, hand to boot, hand to strap, bundle untied and retied. Count by touch, if not by sight. That small inward exhale when everything that should be there is in fact there. Or the other feeling, the colder one, when something has gone and the room suddenly loses its dawn gentleness and becomes once more an argument waiting to happen. The source presents the morning check almost casually, but I think it deserves reverence. It is one of the oldest little ceremonies of human travel, the liturgy of continued ownership. Fortunately, for our traveler tonight, let us say the check goes well. The purse is still where it was hidden. The knife is still in its place. The blanket was not yours, so its departure is not a theft, but a reminder. The bundle remains serviceable. though it now smells distinctly of smoke, straw, and other people's survival, which may not improve its market value but certainly improves its honesty. If you were standing here with me by the door now, you would feel the outer air reaching in every time someone leaves or enters from the yard. It is cleaner than the room air, colder too, and it carries morning smells that seem almost ceremonial after the density of the common room. Wet earth again. Be stable eye. Leather. A little dung. A little fog, perhaps. The road returning to itself. There is always a strange moment at the threshold when the traveler must decide whether to miss the inn already. Not because it was pleasant, exactly, but because it was inhabited, and the road, however beautiful, has no interest in your comfort. The innkeeper settles final matters with the efficiency of a man who has no desire to drag last night into today. A coin due, a nod, perhaps a brief warning about the western track, perhaps no warning at all, if he judges you the kind who never listens until the axle cracks. There may even be the roughest version of goodwill, not warmth, exactly, but the absence of contempt, which in such settings can feel curiously generous. And then you step outside. The sky is pale, not bright yet, but open enough that the road can be seen properly. The mud of last night is still mud, though now it has edges. The world smells wider. Breath leaves in softer clouds. You turn once, maybe, to look at the inn from the yard. In daylight, it is less mysterious, lower, more practical. A building like many others, weathered, smoky, a little stooped by years of labor. You might almost think the night inside it had been exaggerated by darkness. Then you catch the smell of its chimney on your cloak and know the night was real enough. I have always thought that is the quiet genius of such places. They do not need to be beautiful to become memorable. They become memorable because the body carries them away. In your shoulders, in the smell of wool, in the stiffness of your knees, in the simple fact of being alive and road ready again. The source ends this phase with departure, and rightly so, because the inn was never the point. The road was the point. The inn existed so the road could continue. That is perhaps the most medieval truth of all. Shelter is not an end state. It is an interval, a knot tied in the long thread of movement. So now the boots find the road once more. The body resettles under its baggage. The rhythm returns slowly. One step, then another. The first few, always a little resentful, until the joints warm and the day begins making its own terms. Behind you, the innkeeper is already turning the room toward its next evening. Ahead of you lie whatever miles, weather, and people the day has prepared. And as you walk, the memory of the inn changes. What seemed crowded becomes communal. What seemed rough becomes useful. What seemed barely enough becomes, in hindsight, exactly enough. You were fed. You were warmed. You were not alone. You slept in pieces, but the pieces held. That is what a medieval inn gave you at dawn. Not rest perfected, not comfort earned by right. A little bread, a little information, a little smoke still in the cloak, a body not entirely repaired, but sufficiently returned to itself, enough to step back into the world and keep going, which, for most travelers, then as now, is sometimes the only definition of a successful night that truly matters. Once the inn is behind you, and the road has taken back the morning, something subtle begins to happen. The body, which spent the whole night criticizing every part of the arrangement, starts revising its opinion. Not completely. Your back does not become poetic. Your neck does not suddenly praise straw. Your feet remain aware of what floor and cold and too little proper sleep have done to them. But as the day opens and the landscape widens, the night at the inn begins settling into memory. And memory is often kinder than the bones, while still being, in its own way, truthful. If you were walking here with me now, the air cool enough to keep your face awake, and the mud beginning to dry in patches where the early light reaches it, you might notice how much sharper the world feels after such a night. The hedges are greener, the crows louder, the rut in the road more detailed. Even the sky seems broader, because you have just come from a room where every inch of space had to be shared, negotiated, defended, or surrendered. To step back outdoors after that is like loosening a tight collar. Not luxury, release. And this, I think, is the point where the deeper lesson of the medieval inn appears. Modern people tend to think of sleep as a private event, almost a moral right. A room, a bed, clean sheets, controlled temperature, darkness arranged to our liking, silence, or near enough. We speak of good sleep as though the world has agreed to protect the fragile theater of our preferences. A medieval traveler would have recognized some of those desires. Certainly, human bodies have not changed so much that they stopped wanting softness. But the expectation was different. Sleep was not judged by whether it felt exquisite. It was judged by what it allowed. Could you rise? Could you walk? Were your goods still with you? Had the cold spared your fingers enough for laces, straps, rinds, work? Had the night passed without theft, fire, or worse? If so, then, in the practical moral universe of the road, the sleep had done its job. The source makes that point with admirable calm. A medieval inn was neither a dream refuge nor a pure misery chamber. It was a rough human instrument, and like many rough instruments, it was more honest about its purpose than the polished things that came after it. It did not pretend to love you. It did not flatter your fatigue with promises it could not keep. It gave you straw, smoke, food if possible, witness, and a little heat. The rest was your own business. Honestly, there is something almost refreshing about that. Not because hardship is lovely. I do not think that, and neither should anyone with a functioning spine, but because the inn reveals how much of what we call comfort is really expectation, and how many human beings across time have gone on living, working, trading, praying, and traveling with much less of it than we would call tolerable. Not joyfully all the time, certainly, often with complaint, and very right too. But still, they went on. If you were walking beside me long enough after such a night, you might even begin to feel a little gratitude toward the room you were so ready to resent at midnight. The smoke in your cloak is annoying, yes, but it is also proof of warmth. The roughness in your shoulders is unpleasant, but it is the ache of shelter rather than exposure. The bread you ate was plain, but it reached morning with you. The people were strangers, but they formed a kind of temporary wall against a darker, emptier night. You know that feeling when a bad night becomes, by noon, almost a good story. Not because it was secretly delightful, but because survival has a way of polishing certain edges while leaving the truth intact. The medieval inn belongs to that category. A place you complain about while in it, and remember with more tenderness once the rain starts again 2 miles later. The source also suggests something more subtle, that the inn taught a traveler how to belong to a world of thresholds. Not home, not road entirely, not public, not private. The inn was a middle condition, and perhaps medieval life itself was fuller of such middle conditions than ours. A peasant in service, a pilgrim between shrines, a merchant between fairs, a messenger between lords, a monk on business outside his usual walls, people in motion, identities temporarily loosened by distance and weather. The inn held all of them for one night under a single smoky roof. That kind of temporary society leaves its mark. You walk differently after a night among others, more aware of your own noise, more respectful of small, practical mercies, less likely, perhaps, to romanticize solitude. The room full of sleepers, with all its discomforts, reminds you that rest is sometimes a collective achievement. Someone kept the fire. Someone barred the door. Someone accepted your coin instead of turning you out. Someone made the stew. Someone fed the horse. Even your broken sleep depended on the labor and presence of people whose names you may never know. I have always found that quietly beautiful. Human survival is often least visible where it is most constant. The innkeeper who stayed half awake, the servant who rose first, the woman who shared blanket space with a child, the local man whose mere presence near the hearth discouraged one fool from becoming a thief. None of them would describe themselves as constructing a delicate network of communal endurance. They would laugh at such language, and rightly so. But that is what they were doing all the same. The source ends with the traveler continuing on, and that is exactly right, because the inn only makes sense in relation to movement. A house where no one passes through is just a house. An inn is a promise made to the road. It says, not comfort awaits, but interruption. A pause. A chance for your bones to stop ringing from the cart, for your boots to dry a little, for your purse to remain yours, for your hunger to be less sharp by dawn. Then go on. If you were to look back once more from a rise in the road, you might see the roofline still breathing smoke into the pale sky. Small, now. Almost ordinary. Another traveler would be arriving there tonight with his own wet cloak, her own sore legs, their own mood of caution and tired hope. The room would gather them too. The same benches, the same rushes, the same negotiation of coin, fire, straw, and trust. Nothing grand, nothing legendary. And yet it would matter to them as much as it mattered to you. That repetition is worth pausing over. The medieval inn was not memorable, because it was unique. It was memorable because it was repeated, night after night, generation after generation. Countless anonymous arrivals at dusk, countless departures at gray dawn, countless little dramas of fatigue, suspicion, warmth, hunger, bargaining, and relief. Most left no written trace. Yet together they formed one of the quiet infrastructures of the old world. Roads depended on them. Trade depended on them. Pilgrimage depended on them. News depended on them. Even kingdoms, in their heavy, distant way, depended on small, smoky rooms where ordinary people managed not to collapse between one jurisdiction and the next. There were richer houses, certainly, manor guest chambers, monastic lodgings, better appointed urban hostels in prosperous towns. The source never denies that differences of class changed the night. But the common medieval inn, the one the tired, ordinary traveler was most likely to know, belonged to a harder arithmetic. How many bodies? How much straw? How much ale? How much daylight left? How much risk the innkeeper judged worth accepting under one roof? In that arithmetic there was little room for fantasy, and perhaps that is why the memory of it feels so solid. It was built out of measurable things, and that, perhaps, is the truest answer to what it was really like to sleep in a medieval inn. It was rarely pleasant in the modern sense. It was often noisy. The straw itched. The blankets smelled of old fire and older shoulders. The air was thick. The floor knew every hardness in your body. The privacy was almost non-existent. Sleep came in fragments. Cold kept its own counsel until dawn. Other people snored with a confidence no one had given them. Dogs claimed the warm places. Horses knocked the stable boards at inconvenient hours. The bread was coarse. The ale was rough. The room asked you to compromise with everything. And still it held. Still it fed. Still it warmed. Still it gathered scattered human lives into one rough-breathing shelter and returned them to the road in the morning. Not restored, perhaps, but preserved. And sometimes preservation is the most merciful form of kindness the world can offer. If you were sitting here with me again by the fire, the modern room quiet and controlled around us, I think that would be the last thing I would want to place gently in your mind before the story closes. Medieval rest was not built around comfort. It was built around enough. Enough straw to soften the floor. Enough wool to borrow some warmth. Enough food to sleep at all. Enough watchfulness to keep your coin. Enough other people that the night outside did not become absolute. Enough morning left in your limbs to keep walking. There is a dignity in that old enough, enough that our smoother age sometimes forgets. The traveler learns it by degrees. First, in the aching shoulders, then in the smell of smoke that follows the cloak onto the road, then in the strange, mild affection that appears for the inn only after it has been left behind, then in the way the next night's shelter, however different, is judged not against fantasy, but against function. Roof, fire, food, witness, morning. That is the scale now. And perhaps that is why the medieval inn remains so vivid in imagination. Not because it was cozy, and not because it was miserable, but because it reveals a version of human rest, stripped down to its oldest shape, bodies together against weather. A little light in the dark. Shared risk. Shared warmth. Shared interruption of the road. Sleep as a practical truce rather than a perfected retreat. There is something else, too. A night in such a place changes how one sees other people. On the road, strangers are shapes at a distance. Possible danger, possible nuisance, possible help if forced by circumstance. Inside the inn, they become breathing evidence that every traveler is carrying some private burden of hunger, cold, worry, memory, hope, or duty. The merchant with the cough is no longer only a merchant. He is a man who curls around his bundle in his sleep. The loud pilgrim is a man whose boots pinch him enough that he rubs one foot before lying down. The child is not merely noise. The child is warmth in the crook of a mother's blanket. Shared lodging exposes humanity in unflattering ways, but also in clarifying ones. That may be why the road feels different after such a night. You do not become softer exactly. The medieval world punishes softness when it becomes foolish. But perhaps you become more exact in your understanding. Every traveler is passing between weather and walls, between danger and bargaining, between loneliness and the temporary company of others. The inn does not erase those tensions. It gathers them under one roof until dawn sorts them back onto the road. And when evening comes again somewhere farther on, and the next roof appears beyond the mud and the dim field boundaries, the body will remember faster than the mind. The smell of smoke will mean possible rest. The sight of a lit shutter will mean pause. The rough outline of an inn against the dark will mean not pleasure, not luxury, but one more chance to be held together for a few hours by fire. Food, straw, and the old human habit of not letting strangers freeze if there is still floor enough to share. The road goes on. It always does. But for one night, the inn stood between you and the dark. And in a hard world that was a kind of grace. Rough-voiced, smoky, unsentimental, and absolutely real. Good night.